The winter in Albany, New York was cruel, but that night the cold was nothing compared to the cruelty of the people who should have loved me. I was 19 years old and I thought I still had a home, but in one violent instant that illusion shattered. My name is Samantha Hayes, though most call me Sam, and the night my stepfather dragged me out into the snow was the night I stopped believing family would protect me. Harold Green, a man of 52 whose rough hands smelled of oil and whiskey, gripped my arm like a vice. He yanked me through the open doorway across the porch where icicles hung like knives and flung me into the yard where snow piled up to my knees. My body hit the ground with a sound that rang in my ears, the icy crust cutting into my palms, and the shock of it stole my breath. Pain shot through my side as Harold leaned over me, his shadow long and heavy under the porch light. Behind him, my mother, Linda Green, 48 years old, stood motionless. She did not scream for him to stop, did not run to help me. She only crossed her arms and said in a voice colder than the frost in the air, "You should have listened." Those words pierced me deeper than his grip because they told me she had already chosen her side. Harold's voice cracked through the night, raw and full of venom. "This house belongs to your cousin Mia now. You have nothing here, Samantha." His spit landed in the snow beside me, sizzling like acid in my imagination. He pressed his boot into my arm, not enough to break, but enough to remind me I was powerless beneath him. My lips split under the force of his earlier shove, and blood trickled onto the untouched white ground, spreading like ink on paper, staining what had once felt like the only safe place I knew. Across the street I saw lights flicker on. Curtains shifted. Old Mr. Bill, who had known me since I was a child, stood behind his window with the phone pressed to his ear. His wife Margaret's face appeared beside him, her mouth covered by her hand. Their eyes met mine across the icy street, and in that look I saw something worse than pity. I saw helplessness. They knew what Harold was doing. They were calling the police, but they did not come outside. No one did. Behind them, more windows lit up silhouettes gathering watching. My humiliation burned hotter than the bruises spreading across my body. I was not just being beaten. I was being paraded as weak in front of the very community that had once smiled at me when I carried groceries for my mother or shoveled snow for my grandfather. Now they saw me as the girl no one would save. When the sirens finally pierced the silence, Harold yanked me back onto my feet and shoved me against the porch rail. He straightened his shirt, his breath clouding the air as if nothing had happened. Linda stepped closer, her hand brushing against his arm like she was comforting him. Not me. The officers arrived, flashlights sweeping across the snow. I stood there shaking my lip, bleeding my knees raw, my chest rising and falling like I had run a mile, and I wanted to shout the truth. But my voice failed me. My mother spoke first, saying it was only a family disagreement. Harold nodded, calm, polite, his eyes glittering with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing the world bends in your favor when there is no proof. The officers looked at me, a girl trembling in the yard, but with no affidavit, no signed statement, nothing to hold against him. They left after a warning. Their car rolled away, red and blue lights fading into the distance, leaving me standing in silence with the neighbor's curtains already drawn again. That silence was worse than the strike of his hand. It told me I was truly alone. My stepfather smirked, my mother turned her back, and the house that was supposed to shelter me felt like a cage closing in. Yet in the middle of that despair, through the ringing in my ears, I heard the echo of a different voice. My grandfather, George Hayes, who had built his life fixing cars in Syracuse, had once held my hands in his and said, "Someday this legacy will be yours." At the time, I thought he was only being kind, giving a girl without a father some hope. But now, with blood in the snow and shame burning in my chest, his words were the only thing keeping me from collapsing completely. Maybe he had meant more. Maybe he had left me something they could not take. I forced myself upright, the cold gnawing at my skin, but a new fire rising inside. They thought they had destroyed me. They thought they had thrown me away. They were wrong. When I was little, long before Harold Green entered our lives, my world revolved around one man, my grandfather, George Hayes. He was not perfect, but to me he was the kind of man who carried strength without needing to prove it. He owned a garage in Syracuse, a modest place where the scent of motor oil and steel always clung to his clothes. Some children grew up on bedtime stories about princesses or fairy tales, but mine were told while sitting on a workbench listening to the sound of wrenches clinking against metal. He would wipe his hands on a rag, lift me onto his lap, and say that one day I would understand what it meant to keep something alive with my own two hands. He looked at the garage like it was a living thing, not just a place that fixed cars. And when he looked at me, he often said, "Someday, this legacy will be yours." At the time, I thought he was only softening the blow of growing up without a father. My real father had passed when I was very young, leaving my mother and me in a house that always felt a little emptier than it should have. My mother Linda was still young when she met Harold, and at first I thought she deserved to smile again. But smiles can hide many things, and Harold's smile was one of them. He had a laugh that seemed charming in public, yet at home it carried the sharp edge of control. My grandfather never trusted him fully. I remember once overhearing George tell Linda that Harold liked to talk about responsibility, but avoided carrying it. My mother brushed it off, insisting that Harold would change with time, but time did not soften him. It hardened him. Growing up with Harold meant learning early that silence was safer than truth. He had a way of filling a room with tension, of making every dinner feel like walking across thin ice. My mother, who had once been gentle, began to mirror him. I told myself she was tired, overwhelmed, maybe just afraid of being left alone again. But the reality became clear as I grew older. She was choosing him every single day over me. And it was not only Harold that pulled her away. There was also Mia, my cousin from Boston. She was polished, ambitious, and far away, but somehow she was always present in our house. My mother adored her, sent money, bought her gifts, bragged about her grades and her marketing job, even when Mia rarely visited or even called. When I needed new shoes for school, my mother sighed and said we would wait for next month. But when Mia wanted help with her rent in Boston, the money appeared overnight. That contrast cut deep because I was there every day, helping, cooking, cleaning, paying bills when Harold lost another job, and yet my efforts were invisible. By the time I turned 16, I had taken on more responsibility than most adults I knew. I balanced high school with part-time jobs in Lake Placid, sometimes cleaning motel rooms, sometimes waiting tables in diners where the smell of bacon grease clung to my hair long after the shift ended. I saved every dollar I could. At night, I studied under the dim light of my bedroom, the walls thin enough that I could hear Harold's voice booming from the living room as he complained about politics or money. My mother rarely came in to check on me. She was too busy on the phone with Mia, her voice soft, almost tender, in a way I had not heard directed at me for years. That sound carved into me because I realized tenderness was something she could give, she just chose not to give it to me. My grandfather tried to fill the void, even as age wore him down. He would drive to Albany on weekends, bringing bags of groceries or tools he insisted I learn to use. He taught me how to change a tire, how to patch a leak, how to handle money with caution. "You cannot trust everyone with what you have," he said more than once, his eyes narrowing in a way that suggested he was speaking of Harold. He would sit with me on the porch and share stories about the Depression, about how his father had taught him to value every dime, and he would always end with the same line: "Someday, this will be yours, Sam." Not just the garage, not just the house, but the sense of pride in building something with honesty. He never said it to Mia. He never even mentioned her. It was always me. When he passed away 2 years before that night in the snow, the grief was like a heavy stone crushing my chest. I remember the funeral in Syracuse, the way people spoke of him as a man who never broke his word. I stood by his casket, my hand resting on the wood, and felt completely unmoored. I thought at least I still had my mother, but even there she seemed distant, clinging to Harold's side, as if I were just another guest at the service. After the burial, I went back to Albany, determined to keep his lessons alive, to honor him by carrying the load he had trusted me with. That meant working more hours, paying bills when Harold once again lost his temper at an employer and quit, and covering for my mother's endless financial bailouts of Mia. I told myself it was temporary, that one day they would see my loyalty and reward it, but every year the divide grew wider. The house itself became a symbol of my sacrifice. I painted its peeling walls, replaced broken steps, fixed leaks in the roof when Harold refused. I used my savings to cover utility bills when the notices piled up. I kept the lights on the heat, running the water flowing while Harold sat in front of the television complaining about the world. My mother occasionally thanked me, but always lightly, like she was acknowledging a favor from a neighbor, not the backbone of her household. And then, almost always, she shifted the conversation back to Mia, to how Mia was thriving in Boston, how Mia deserved so much, how proud she was of her. I would nod, forcing a smile even as anger burned inside. By 18, I was exhausted. I should have been preparing for college, but instead I was drowning in bills. I enrolled in community classes when I could work every free hour and tried to imagine a future beyond the four walls of a house that felt more like a prison. But even as I considered leaving, I could not. Because of my grandfather. Because of his words. Because I believed the house, the garage, the legacy would eventually be recognized as mine. I had been the one to keep it standing, and I thought surely that meant something. I did not see the betrayal coming. I should have with all the signs, but I refused to believe my own mother would cast me aside. I convinced myself that Harold's cruelty was separate from her, that Mia's presence was just a distraction. I did not understand until too late that my mother's silence, her softness toward Mia, her loyalty to Harold, were choices she was making every single day. Choices that left me invisible except when they needed my labor or my money. Looking back, I can trace the lines of favoritism, of control, of neglect. But at the time, I clung to hope like a drowning person clings to driftwood. I told myself that one day I would be acknowledged, that one day the sacrifices would be seen, that one day I would not be just the daughter who filled in the cracks, but the heir my grandfather promised me I was. That faith kept me going even when the weight of responsibility nearly crushed me. But it also blinded me. It blinded me to the truth that would explode in my face the night Harold's boot pressed into my arm and my mother's words sealed my exile. The tension in our house never came all at once. It grew the way rust spreads over metal, slowly, quietly, until one day you realize the strength has been eaten away. By the time I was 19, Harold had lost yet another job. He blamed everyone but himself. He said his boss did not respect him, that the company was corrupt, that the whole world was against him. What it really meant was that he sat at home day after day, drinking and barking orders while I dragged myself from class to shifts at the diner, then home again to pay bills he should have handled. The gas bill, the water bill, even the groceries, they all seemed to land in my lap. I told myself that if I just kept the house running, things would calm down. But nothing calmed Harold. He prowled the halls like a storm cloud, snapping at small things, cursing when the remote was missing, slamming doors when the mail carried another overdue notice. My mother's role in all of this cut deeper than his rage. She stopped pretending to balance between us. She chose her side, and she chose it loudly. Mia, she would say, Mia has a future. You, Sam, you are just stuck here. Every time she said it, my chest tightened until it felt like I could not breathe. She compared me to my cousin as if we were contestants in a competition I had never agreed to enter. Mia was living in Boston, working in marketing, dressed in heels and blouses, attending brunches and networking events. I was covered in diner grease and exhaustion. But the comparison was unfair in more ways than one because Mia had been handed opportunities I never saw financed by my own mother's wallet. Still, my mother repeated it as if it were truth carved into stone. The night it all boiled over began like any other. I came home late from work, my hands aching from carrying trays and scrubbing counters. The house smelled of whiskey and reheated leftovers. Harold sat at the table, his face flushed, his hand around a glass. My mother was beside him, flipping through a stack of papers I recognized as bills. I dropped my bag and pulled out the small wad of cash from my apron pocket, ready to hand it over before they could ask. My mother took it without a word, sliding it into the pile. Harold smirked and muttered that at least I was good for something. That remark dug deep, but I bit my tongue. Dinner was tense. We sat at the table, the three of us chewing in near silence while the hum of the refrigerator filled the room. Then my mother spoke, her voice sharp as she set down her fork. Mia called today, she said. She is visiting next month, and I think it is time we talked about the house. My fork froze halfway to my mouth. The house. The only thing I had poured myself into for years. I stared at her, waiting for her to continue praying that maybe finally she would acknowledge my sacrifices. Instead, she looked straight at me and said, Mia will inherit this place. It makes sense. She has a family to support. You will manage on your own. The words hit me like a slap before Harold's hand ever touched me. I stared at her, my heart pounding, my throat dry. I had painted these walls fixed, the roof paid the bills. I had given up pieces of myself for this house, and now she was handing it over to someone who had not even lived here. I found my voice at last and whispered, "That is not fair." Harold laughed a low, cruel laugh and said, "Life is not fair, kid. Be grateful we let you stay this long." My mother nodded in agreement as if she had rehearsed this conversation with him. I snapped then. Months, years of silence cracked apart, and words poured out of me. I told them how I had covered every overdue bill, how I had worked nights, how I had bled for this house. My voice rose shaking, and I looked at my mother as if begging her to wake up and see me. Instead, she slammed her fork against the table so hard it rattled the plates. "Enough," she shouted. "This is not your decision. You have no say here." I barely saw Harold's hand move before the sting exploded across my cheek. My head whipped to the side, the room spinning, the taste of iron flooding my mouth. For a second the world went silent, and all I could hear was my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. My mother did not gasp. She did not cry out. She only sat there, her eyes cold, her lips pressed into a thin line. That silence hurt more than the strike. It told me I was alone at that table, and maybe I always had been. I pressed a hand to my cheek, trembling. Every muscle in me screamed to run, but I stayed rooted to the chair as if leaving would mean abandoning the last thread of my grandfather's promise. My breath came ragged, my chest rising and falling like waves crashing against a shore. I looked between them, the man who struck me and the woman who let him, and something inside me broke. It was in that silence that I realized the truth. This was not just about money, it was about control. Harold wanted me small and dependent. My mother wanted Mia elevated and adored. And together they had decided my place in their world, beneath them, beneath Mia. Always beneath. I swallowed the pain, the fury, the humiliation, and I told myself I would not cry in front of them. They did not deserve my tears. I pushed back from the table, my chair scraping against the floor, and stood tall even though my knees shook. "If you give her this house," I said, my voice hoarse but steady, "then you will regret it." Harold's face twisted with rage, but my mother only smirked as if my defiance amused her. Her smirk followed me as I left the room, her voice echoing in my ears. "Mia has a future. You do not." In that moment, something inside me shifted. I had spent years carrying their weight, clinging to the hope that love and sacrifice would be enough. But now I saw it clearly. To them, I was invisible, disposable. To them, I was nothing more than labor and silence. And if I stayed, if I kept bowing my head, that was all I would ever be. That night, as I lay in my room with my cheek throbbing and my chest heavy with betrayal, I understood for the first time that the fight was no longer about surviving another day. It was about reclaiming everything they had tried to strip away. My voice, my dignity, my future. And though I did not yet know how, I swore to myself that I would not let them erase me. The night after that dinner still burns in my memory, every detail sharpened by the humiliation and the sting on my cheek. Harold's words echoed in my head. "You have nothing here." Samantha, while my mother's silence echoed even louder. I tried to sleep, but the walls felt like they were closing in the house itself, pressing down on me as if to remind me it was no longer mine. When morning came, the bruise on my face had darkened to a deep purple. I traced it with trembling fingers in the mirror, anger rising like a fever. I had been dismissed, struck, and silenced, and the people who should have defended me had instead celebrated my pain. I thought about leaving, about walking away from the house and everything tied to it, but the thought collapsed under the weight of my grandfather's voice. "Someday, this legacy will be yours." The words played over and over until they felt like a lifeline. That afternoon, Harold's anger flared again. He accused me of disrespect, of thinking I was better than him. His words turned to shouts, his body looming too close, and before I could step back, he shoved me out the door into the cold yard once more. The snow crunched beneath me as I landed hard, my breath catching in my chest. My mother appeared at the door, her arms crossed her face unreadable, and she let him tower over me. I pushed myself up the cold, searing my skin through my jeans, and I saw curtains shift across the street. Bill and Margaret were there again, eyes wide, lips tight, phones clutched in their hands. For a moment, I thought someone would rush to help, but no one came. They watched helpless, and I realized that in their silence lay another truth. In the eyes of the community, I was just another victim of a family too private, too toxic for outsiders to change. The humiliation cut deeper than the shove. I was not only betrayed inside my house, I was being abandoned outside of it too. The police came, lights flashing, questions asked. I stood shivering in the snow, my words trapped in my throat. Harold played his part with ease, calm, and controlled, now saying we had argued nothing more. Linda supported his story, adding that I had exaggerated. My lip trembled, my chest tight, and I wanted to scream the truth. But without proof, without sworn words on paper, without witnesses willing to testify, the officers left again. They warned Harold to calm down, then drove away, tires crunching over the icy street. Their departure felt like a verdict. I was invisible. Inside, Harold sneered, satisfied. He leaned close, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "No one believes you. You will never win." I clenched my fists, heat rising in my chest. For years, I had let their words sink into me like poison, but something shifted in that moment. His confidence, his certainty that I had no power, lit a fire I had not felt before. My grandfather's words surged back, not as comfort, but as a challenge. Someday, this legacy will be yours. What if he had meant it literally? What if he had left me more than a memory? I returned to my room that night, every muscle aching, and pulled out the old box of photographs I had kept since childhood. Buried among them was a picture of my grandfather standing in front of his garage, his arm around me, his smile weathered but proud. Behind him, nailed to the wall, was a sign that read, "Hayes Legacy Auto." My throat tightened as I traced the letters with my finger. He had always called it a legacy, not just a business, not just a house. And then I remembered something he had once told me on the porch, years before he passed. "Sam, I have taken care of things," he had said, his eyes serious. "It is all safe, and one day you will understand." That memory burst through the fog of despair and settled like a spark in my mind. What if he had left documents? What if he had made sure the house or the garage or something was meant for me? My heart pounded as the thought grew stronger, and I knew I could not ignore it. I could not let Harold and Linda decide the narrative. I had to find out the truth for myself. The idea of searching for answers terrified me. If I was wrong, if there was nothing, then I would be left with even less than before. But if I was right, if my grandfather had truly left me something, then everything could change. That possibility filled me with a determination I had not felt in years. I opened my laptop, my hands still shaking, and began searching through county records. Most of the files were sealed, but the thought of legal documents, of wills, of affidavits kept me going. If my grandfather had left something, it would not vanish into thin air. It would be filed somewhere official, undeniable. I knew I needed help. Alone, I was just a 19-year-old girl beaten into silence. With the right guidance, I could be more. My mind turned immediately to Rachel Carter, my best friend since high school. She was 2 years older, studying law with the kind of focus that made me trust her with anything. She had always been the one to tell me not to back down, the one to remind me that justice was more than a dream. Picking up the phone, I dialed her number with trembling fingers, and when her voice answered calm and steady, I felt something inside me finally breathe. Rachel listened without interrupting as I poured everything out. The fights, the favoritism, the bruise still fresh on my cheek. And finally, the memory of my grandfather's words. "Do you have any paperwork?" she asked, her tone all business now. "Anything from your grandfather?" My heart sank. I did not. Not in my possession. But maybe, I whispered, maybe it is filed somewhere. Rachel went quiet for a moment, then said, "Give me time. I will look." Her certainty steadied me, and for the first time in days, I felt hope stronger than despair. When the call ended, I sat alone in my room, the shadows stretching across the walls. My cheek still throbbed, my body still ached, but my mind was alive. The fight had begun. I no longer felt like prey waiting to be devoured. I felt like someone preparing for war. Harold and Linda believed they had stripped me of everything, but they had not counted on my grandfather's promise, and they had not counted on me finding my own voice. The next morning I woke with a pounding heart, the echo of Harold's threats still clinging to my ears. But beneath the fear was something new, a thread of hope stitched together by Rachel's promise to check the records. I clutched my phone like a lifeline waiting for her message, unable to eat, unable to focus on anything else. Hours felt like days, and I paced my room as the winter sun crawled across the floor. When her call finally came, her voice carried a current of urgency. "Sam," she said, "I think you need to hear this sitting down." My knees gave out and I sank to the edge of my bed. She explained that she had contacted a colleague in Syracuse who had access to probate filings. They had located my grandfather's will. It had been notarized, stamped, and officially filed with the Onondaga County Clerk's office. The words she read out struck me like thunder. George Hayes leaves to his granddaughter Samantha Hayes sole ownership of his garage, the adjoining property, and any accounts tied to it, including assets held in Massachusetts. My throat closed. My hands trembled so violently I almost dropped the phone. It was real. Not just a memory, not just a comforting phrase whispered on a porch, but a legal document signed and sealed. Rachel's tone grew sharper, as if she sensed how fragile my composure was. "This will is valid," she said. "The house in Albany is tied to that estate. The accounts in Massachusetts give the Boston Federal Court jurisdiction. They cannot legally override this. Your mother and Harold must have known, and they hid it from you." The betrayal hit me like another blow, sharper than Harold's fist. My own mother had seen this document and chosen silence, chosen to let Harold strip me of everything. I pressed my forehead into my palm, shaking with rage and grief, but beneath it all, a new determination surged. If my grandfather had entrusted me with his legacy, then I owed it to him and to myself to fight. Rachel told me the first step was to gather every piece of proof I had that tied me to the upkeep of the property. Bills, receipts, photographs, anything that showed my sweat and sacrifice. "We will file a claim to enforce the will," she explained, "but the stronger our evidence, the faster the court will move." Her voice steadied me, and I grabbed a box from my closet, pulling out the scraps of my life that had once felt meaningless. I laid them out across my bed, envelopes of utility payments with my name on the checks, receipts from hardware stores for paint and tools, invoices from contractors I had paid out of my own pocket. Each slip of paper was a shard of truth proof that I had been the one holding the house together while Harold and Linda watched from the sidelines. Rachel insisted I needed more than receipts. "You have to file an affidavit," she said, her tone firm. "A sworn statement notarized describing your contributions and the abuse you have endured. Without it, the defense will argue your word means nothing." The thought of putting it all into words, of exposing the darkest corners of my life on paper, terrified me. But then I pictured Harold's sneer, my mother's smirk, Mia's entitlement, and I realized silence had already cost me too much. I agreed. We set a time to meet at her office in downtown Albany. That evening, I sat at my desk, pen in hand, notebook open, and forced myself to write. My hand shook as I described how Harold had dragged me into the snow, how Linda had stood by, how neighbors had called the police, but nothing had changed. I wrote about the nights spent working double shifts to cover bills, about the repairs I had made, about the dreams my grandfather had planted in me. The words poured out like blood from a wound, messy, painful, but necessary. By the time I finished, my hands were cramped and my eyes raw from tears. I placed the notebook in my bag, ready for Rachel to help me craft it into the affidavit that would carry my voice where my shouts had been ignored. The following day, Rachel's office smelled faintly of coffee and ink, the walls lined with casebooks that made the room feel heavy with authority. She greeted me with a hug, then sat me at her desk and began typing as I spoke. Line by line, my suffering became testimony. She formatted it with legal precision, each fact tied to dates, each detail clear and unflinching. When she printed the document, the weight of it in my hands felt heavier than paper. It felt like armor. We walked together to a notary public 2 blocks away, the snow crunching under our boots, my breath fogging the air. The notary read the document aloud, asked if the contents were true, and I swore they were, with a voice steadier than I expected. When I signed my name and the stamp pressed into the page, something inside me shifted. For the first time, I was not just a victim. I was a claimant, someone with rights, someone the law could no longer ignore. Rachel's plan did not end there. She told me we needed indisputable evidence of Harold's abuse, something more than bruises that faded and words that could be denied. That is when she introduced me to Mark Stevens, a private investigator she trusted in Albany. Mark was in his 40s with the weary look of a man who had seen too much, but his handshake was firm and his voice carried confidence. He agreed to set up discreet cameras around the property to capture the truth of Harold's temper. It was a risk, but one worth taking. My stomach churned at the thought of Harold discovering it, but the memory of the officers shrugging and walking away gave me courage. Without proof, I was invisible. With it, I could bring him down. Days turned into a blur of preparation. I gathered photographs of the repairs I had made to the house, images of me on ladders with paint rollers of new fixtures installed in the kitchen, of receipts stapled to instruction manuals. Rachel compiled it all into a binder, her sharp eyes scanning for weaknesses. Mark checked in regularly, updating us on the footage he was collecting. Meanwhile, Harold and Linda seemed oblivious, confident in their control. Harold barked orders. Linda sneered, and Mia called with her demands, believing she already owned what was mine. Their arrogance blinded them to the storm building beneath their feet. Late one night, as I sat surrounded by receipts and photographs, exhaustion pressing down on me, I looked at my grandfather's old coffee mug resting on my desk. It was chipped, worn, and simple, but it had survived longer than his voice. I held it to my chest and whispered, "I will not let them erase you." And for the first time, I believed it. The evidence was growing. The truth was being stitched into a shield, and soon, very soon, I would carry it into the light, where no one could deny me again. The affidavit sat heavy in my bag like a weapon I had never thought I would carry. But now that I had it, I could feel its weight reminding me that I was no longer powerless. Each day that passed after signing, it was filled with a mixture of fear and anticipation. I had lived so long under Harold's shadow that it felt unnatural to walk through the house with my head held higher, but something inside me had shifted. I was not simply enduring anymore. I was preparing. Rachel kept urging me to stay steady, to document everything, to leave no corner uncovered. She said that when people like Harold realized their grip was slipping, they struck harder, and I needed to be ready for the storm. So I spent hours compiling every receipt and bank statement, lining them up in folders. Hospital bills that showed bruises and sprains, grocery receipts that proved I was the one keeping food on the table. Photographs of every corner of the house that I had repaired with my own hands. I scoured through my emails and found old confirmations of utility payments, my name printed in black and white, where it should have been my mother's or Harold's. Each scrap of evidence was like a brick, and together they formed a wall that would stand against their lies. Mark, the investigator, came by one evening under the cover of darkness to retrieve the footage he had collected. He showed me on his small laptop screen, his fingers steady as he navigated the files. There was Harold, red-faced, shouting at me in the living room. There was Linda, silent, her arms crossed, as if my suffering was a show she had already grown tired of. The camera had caught Harold raising his fist, slamming his hand onto the table, cursing my name. Watching it made my stomach turn shame, rising like bile, but beneath that shame was relief. This was proof, no longer just my word against his. This was something the court could not ignore. Rachel's eyes lit up when she saw the video. "This changes everything," she whispered, and I felt the first true spark of victory flicker inside me. For the first time since my grandfather's death, I felt like his promise was within reach. But Harold sensed the change too. Maybe it was the way I carried myself. Maybe it was the way I no longer bowed my head when he barked orders. Whatever it was, he noticed, and his suspicion grew sharper. One night, he cornered me in the kitchen, his breath heavy with liquor. "You think you can outsmart me," he hissed. "You think a piece of paper will save you." His words slithered around me, meant to choke out my resolve. But I met his eyes and said nothing, my silence a wall he could not breach. That only enraged him more. He slammed his fist on the counter inches from my face, but I did not flinch. Inside, I was trembling, but I knew that Mark's camera hidden in the corner was capturing every second. Linda began to join in more openly, her tone sharp, her words laced with contempt. She mocked me for spending time with Rachel, claimed I was filling my head with nonsense. She laughed at my stack of receipts, saying they were meaningless scraps of paper. But the louder she mocked, the more certain I became that she was afraid. Because deep down, she knew what she had hidden. She knew about the will, and she knew the truth was closing in. The tension grew unbearable, every meal a battlefield, every conversation a trap. Mia called frequently, her voice floating through the speakerphone as if she already owned the walls around me. She asked about paint colors, about furniture, about how quickly she could move in. Each question was another knife twisting into me, but I stayed quiet, writing down her words, keeping them as evidence of her entitlement. Rachel said arrogance often exposed itself, and Mia's arrogance was a gift I would use. Then came the night that tested everything. Harold slammed a stack of papers onto the kitchen table, his face twisted with rage. "Sign this," he demanded. My heart pounded as I glanced down and saw the words waiver of claim. It was a document crudely drafted stating that I relinquished any rights to the house or my grandfather's property. Linda stood beside him, her eyes hard, her lips pressed thin. "You will sign it," she said, "or you will regret it." My hands shook as I picked up the paper, the pen heavy in my grasp. For a moment, fear surged memories of every blow, every shove, every word meant to crush me. But then I remembered Rachel's voice steady and unwavering. I remembered Mark's footage undeniable. I remembered the affidavit signed and stamped with the weight of the law. And I remembered my grandfather, his voice echoing from the past, "Someday this legacy will be yours." I placed the pen down, refusing to sign. Harold's face flushed crimson, his veins bulging as he leaned forward. "You ungrateful little girl," he spat. "Without me, you are nothing." He raised his hand as if to strike, but before it could fall, I whispered, "The court will hear my side." His hand froze in the air. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. He lowered it slowly, his jaw clenched. Linda gasped, her mask of confidence cracking for just a second. They realized then that I was no longer theirs to control. Mark showed me later that the entire confrontation had been captured on video. Harold's threats, Linda's coercion, my refusal to bend. Watching it was painful but also empowering. It was proof not only of their cruelty but of my resistance. Rachel's voice trembled with excitement when she saw it. "This is everything we need," she said. "We can go forward now." Despite the danger, despite the nights I still cried into my pillow, I felt a new strength rooting itself in me. I was no longer simply surviving. I was building a case, brick by brick, that would bring their empire of lies crashing down. Each document, each video, each sworn statement was a weapon, and I was learning to wield them. The days dragged, filled with tension and whispers of Mia's arrival. Harold strutted around the house as if he still owned it, but I saw the cracks in his confidence. Linda clung to him tighter, her words more desperate, her laughter more forced. And I held on to the knowledge that soon, very soon, their laughter would vanish. Because I was ready, because I had proof, because the truth was stronger than their fists, their silence, and their lies. The house in Albany felt like it was shrinking around me, the walls closing tighter every time Harold walked through the door. The winter air outside was brutal, but the cold inside was worse, a silence that carried threats without words. I had gathered my evidence. Rachel had filed the preliminary claim, Mark had the video, and yet every evening I returned to that house because I had nowhere else to go. Each creak of the floorboards announced Harold's presence. Each clang of the radiator carried Linda's sighs, and each shadow seemed to whisper that the storm was coming. It broke one night when Harold stumbled home late, his coat dusted with snow, his boots stamping mud onto the rug I had cleaned only that morning. He tossed his gloves onto the table, his face red with anger, and Linda followed behind him like a shadow. They had been to a lawyer, I could tell by the folder in Harold's hand. He slapped it down onto the table with a smirk, the kind of smile that said he thought he had already won. "You think you are clever, Samantha," he sneered. running to your little friend Rachel, waving your receipts around like they mean something. But this paper, this ends it. He shoved the folder toward me. Inside was another document, more polished this time, clearly prepared by someone who knew the law. It demanded I disclaim all rights to the estate and affirm that Mia was the rightful heir. Linda leaned forward, her eyes burning. Sign it now, she said. This is your last chance. My hands trembled, but I did not reach for the pen. Instead, I looked at Harold, his face flushed with liquor and arrogance, and I whispered, I already filed my affidavit. His smirk faltered, his brows knitting. What did you say? I lifted my chin. I swore under oath to everything you have done, Harold. The court has my statement, the videos, the receipts. It is not just my word anymore. His hand twitched at his side, a dangerous flicker in his eyes. Linda gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, the mask slipping for the first time. You little liar, she spat. You would betray your own mother. My throat tightened, but my voice came stronger than I expected. You betrayed me first. You hid Granddad's will. You tried to erase me from my own life. Harold roared, flipping the table so hard that the folder slid across the floor. He lunged, his fist raised, but in that instant a flash of red from the corner caught his eye. The tiny camera Mark had hidden was recording every second, its light steady and merciless. Harold froze his fist inches from my face. His chest heaved, his eyes darting from me to the camera and back. His voice cracked with rage. Turn that off! Turn it off right now! But it was too late. The truth was no longer his to bury. Linda shrieked, rushing to the corner, but Mark stepped into the doorway. He had been waiting, his phone in hand, already capturing the confrontation live. Harold staggered back, his face drained of color as he realized the trap had been sprung. You set me up, he growled, his voice low and trembling. I stood taller, my fear melting into fury. No, Harold. You set yourself up. All I did was stop hiding. The silence that followed was deafening. Linda clutched Harold's arm, her voice rising into a desperate plea. We can fix this, Harold. We can make her see reason. But Harold shoved her away, pacing the room like a caged animal. His confidence was cracking, the mask slipping piece by piece. I could feel the shift in the air, the balance tipping. For the first time in years, he was the one cornered, not me. Rachel arrived minutes later, her breath fogging in the cold as she burst through the door. She had brought copies of the affidavit notarized and stamped her presence a wave of authority that even Harold could not ignore. She laid the documents on the table, her voice calm but sharp. Harold Green, Linda Green, the evidence against you is overwhelming. I advise you to step back now before you make things worse. Harold laughed, a bitter sound that echoed off the walls. Worse. You think I care about worse? This is my house, my rules. But Rachel did not flinch. Not anymore, she said. The court decides now. Harold lunged again, but this time Mark stepped forward, blocking him with a steady stance. His phone was still raised, recording every second. If you touch her, he said calmly, this footage goes straight to the police. Harold froze again, his chest heaving, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles turned white. Linda collapsed into a chair, her face pale, her hands shaking. Mia's voice rang out suddenly from the speakerphone, shrill and furious. What is happening over there? Why is no one answering me? But no one picked up. Her voice faded into the silence, irrelevant against the reality crashing down. The confrontation stretched into hours, the house filled with the heavy sound of breathing, the occasional muttered threat, the scrape of boots against the floor. At last, Harold stormed out, slamming the door so hard the glass rattled. Linda trailed behind him, her shoulders slumped, her head bowed. The silence that followed was not peace, but it was the beginning of something new. Rachel squeezed my shoulder, her voice soft but firm. You stood your ground, Sam. They cannot unsee that camera. They cannot unsign your affidavit. The tide has turned. That night, I lay in bed, the bruises on my body aching, but my spirit burning brighter than ever. For the first time, I had stared Harold down, and he had blinked. For the first time, Linda's voice had cracked under the weight of her own lies. and for the first time, I believed that the legacy my grandfather had promised me was no longer just a dream. It was real, it was mine, and soon the whole world would see it. But the battle was not over. I knew Harold would not go quietly. Men like him never did. He would thrash, he would rage, he would try to twist the story to make me the villain. But now I had allies, I had evidence, I had the law, and I had my own voice no longer silent, no longer afraid. The confrontation was only the beginning, and the war for justice had just begun. The courthouse in Boston towered above me like a monument to everything I had feared and hoped for. Its gray stone walls felt unyielding, the tall columns reaching skyward, as if they were holding justice itself. I clutched the affidavit in my bag, the notarized seal embossed deep into the paper, its weight more comforting than any embrace. Rachel walked beside me, her voice steady, though I could see the tension in her jaw. "This is it, Sam. Once we step inside, it is no longer just your story. It becomes the law's." Inside the courtroom, the air smelled faintly of wood polish and paper, a scent both sterile and solemn. The benches creaked as people filed in, neighbors from Albany who had heard whispers of the case strangers curious about the dispute over millions. At the front, the American flag stood proudly behind the judge's bench, its presence both humbling and daunting. I took my seat at the plaintiff's table, my hands clammy against the smooth surface while Rachel organized the folders into neat stacks. Then they entered. Harold and Linda walked in together, their faces grim, their steps heavy. Harold wore a suit that strained against his broad shoulders, his jaw set like stone, but the dark circles under his eyes betrayed the sleepless nights. Linda clutched her purse like a shield, her lips pressed thin, her gaze darting nervously around the room. And behind them, Mia slipped in her heels, clicking against the marble floor, her chin high, though her eyes flickered with unease. She had flown from Boston to witness her victory, but the arrogance she had carried in her voice over the phone now seemed thinner, weaker. The bailiff called the court to order, his voice booming. "All rise!" My knees shook as the judge entered robes, sweeping his expression stern, but not unkind. He sat, adjusted his glasses, and glanced down at the docket. "This matter concerns the estate of George Hayes and the contested property in Albany. Counsel, are you ready to proceed?" Rachel rose with a confidence that steadied me. "Yes, Your Honor." The opening statements cut through the silence like knives. Harold's attorney spoke first, painting me as an ungrateful child who had lived off her parents' generosity. He claimed Harold and Linda had supported me for years, that I had no rightful claim to the property, that Mia was the true heir deserving of her future. His words dripped with disdain, designed to make me small, to reduce me to nothing more than a dependent nuisance. My stomach churned, but I kept my head high, waiting for Rachel. When she rose, her voice carried across the room, with a clarity that made people lean forward. "Your Honor, this is not a story of a child refusing to leave her parents' home. This is a story of betrayal, of violence, and of a family's attempt to erase the rightful heir to a legacy worth over $3 million. She laid a hand on the affidavit before her. "We will show that George Hayes, the late grandfather of my client, left his estate to Samantha Hayes, his granddaughter, and no one else. His will was notarized, filed, and preserved in the records of Onondaga County. The defendants knew of this will and chose to conceal it while subjecting my client to abuse and coercion in an effort to steal what was never theirs." The judge's eyes sharpened, and I saw Harold stiffen his fists, clenching beneath the table. Rachel called her first witness. The clerk produced the original will, the seal glinting under the lights, the signature of my grandfather firm and unwavering. The judge examined it carefully, his face unreadable, but the nod he gave when confirming its authenticity sent a surge of relief through my veins. Then came the affidavit. Rachel handed it to the clerk, who read portions aloud. My own words echoed through the courtroom, my testimony of abuse and sacrifice laid bare for strangers and neighbors alike. The humiliation of those nights in the snow, the exhaustion of paying bills that were never mine, the pain of watching my mother turn away every line was a wound reopened, but now they were no longer just my burden. They were evidence. They were power. Harold shifted uneasily, whispering furiously to his attorney, but it was too late. Rachel moved swiftly, presenting photographs of my bruises, receipts of my payment statements from utility companies bearing my name. Each piece landed like a hammer chipping away at the wall Harold had built. And then Mark took the stand. The private investigator testified calmly, his voice even as he described the cameras he had installed and the footage he had captured. The screen flickered to life, and there it was, Harold looming over me shouting, Linda, watching silently, the threats, the raised fist, the moment of refusal. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. I stared at the floor, unable to watch, but I heard the sharp intake of breath from the neighbors who had come. They were seeing the truth with their own eyes, undeniable and raw. Harold erupted, leaping to his feet, his voice booming. That is taken out of context. She provoked me. She is lying. The bailiff stepped forward, warning him to sit down, and the judge's gavel struck sharply. Mr. Green, you will control yourself or you will be removed. Harold collapsed into his chair, his chest heaving, his face red with fury and shame. Rachel pressed forward, calling the neighbors Bill and Margaret, who testified about the night they saw me dragged into the snow, about the calls they made to police, about the fear and helplessness in their hearts. Their voices trembled, but their words painted a picture the judge could not ignore. Finally, Rachel turned to me. Sam, please take the stand. My legs wobbled as I rose each step toward the witness box heavier than the last. I swore the oath, my hand trembling as I promised to tell the truth. Though truth was all I had left, I described my life since my father's death. My grandfather's love, my mother's indifference, Harold's cruelty, Mia's entitlement. I spoke of the night in the snow, of the blood that melted into the white, of the silence of neighbors who could only watch. Tears blurred my vision, but I did not stop. For once, my voice was not silenced. It filled the room, reaching every corner, undeniable. Linda broke then. Her sobs filled the courtroom, her words spilling out. I did not know how to stop him. I did not know what else to do. I thought Mia deserved it more. Her excuses rang hollow, but they cracked the image she had tried to maintain. She looked smaller, weaker, like a woman caught in the web of her own choices. Mia turned pale, her eyes dropping to the table, her hands twisting nervously. The arrogance was gone. All that remained was shame. The judge leaned back, his gaze sweeping over us all. He adjusted his glasses, his voice calm but firm. The evidence presented leaves no doubt. The will is valid, the affidavit sworn, the testimony credible. This court recognizes Samantha Hayes as the rightful heir to the estate of George Hayes. Any attempts to coerce or conceal this inheritance are null and void. The words hit me like a thunderclap, washing over me, cleansing years of fear and humiliation. My chest heaved, my hands shook, but my heart soared. Harold shouted, pounding the table, but bailiffs rushed to restrain him, their hands firm on his shoulders as he fought like a cornered animal. Linda wept openly, her tears staining the papers before her. Mia covered her face, unable to meet my gaze. The gavel struck one final time. Court adjourned. I stumbled back into my seat, Rachel's arm steadying me. Her smile was small but triumphant. You did it, Sam. Justice is yours. Around us, the murmurs of the crowd rose, whispers of sympathy, of support, of vindication. The weight I had carried for so long began to lift, replaced by something fragile and new freedom. Outside, the cold Boston air hit my face sharp and clean. Reporters gathered, microphones flashing, but I ignored them. I tilted my head back, the snowflakes falling soft against my skin, and for the first time in years, the cold did not hurt. It healed. The gavel's echo still rang in my ears as we left the courthouse, the heavy doors swinging shut behind me with a sound that felt like the closing of a chapter. Outside, the snow in Boston glistened under weak sunlight, the city moving briskly as if unaware of the storm that had just broken inside those walls. Rachel walked beside me, her coat pulled tight, her face softened with pride. You stood taller than any of them today, Sam. No one can take that from you now. But the truth was, the victory left me hollow before it filled me. For years, I had poured my strength into surviving Harold's fists and Linda's silence. For months, I had carried the terror of their control, and in the space of one morning, a judge's words had swept it away, confirming that the house, the garage, the accounts, the legacy, all of it was mine by right. Relief battled with exhaustion, pride mingled with grief. Because in winning, I had lost too the illusion of family, the hope of reconciliation, the last fragile thread tying me to my mother. News traveled quickly. By the time Rachel and I drove back to Albany, the community already knew the verdict. Bill and Margaret stopped me on the sidewalk, their faces lined with sympathy. "We are proud of you, Sam," Bill said, his voice trembling. Margaret squeezed my hand, whispering, "You carried yourself with such courage." But there was a shadow in their eyes, too, the guilt of people who had once only watched. I understood. They had done what they could in calling the police. The rest had been mine to fight. Harold did not return to the house that night. The bailiffs had restrained him until his rage burned out, and by afternoon, charges had been filed for domestic violence and attempted coercion. The sheriff's department kept him under watch, and for the first time in years, I walked into the Albany home without fear of hearing his boots stomp behind me. The silence was strange heavy, but it was my silence. Linda, however, was still there. I found her sitting in the kitchen, her face drawn, her eyes rimmed red from crying. She did not look up when I entered. For a moment, I almost pitied her, the woman who had once been my mother, but had chosen loyalty to Harold over love for me. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked. "You destroyed us, Sam. Do you even understand what you have done?" I gripped the back of the chair, my knuckles white. "No, Mom. You destroyed us when you hid the will, when you watched him hurt me and said nothing. I only revealed the truth." She had no reply. Her shoulders sagged, her body seemed to shrink, and I realized she was no longer the towering figure of authority she had once been. She was just a woman who had gambled her daughter away and lost. I left her sitting in that kitchen, unable to give her the comfort she sought. Mia flew back to Boston almost immediately, her dreams of inheriting a furnished house shattered. Friends later told me she had been forced to dip into her own savings to buy a small condo, a far cry from the prize she had believed was hers. I felt no triumph in that only justice. She had built her life on arrogance, expecting my silence to pay for her comfort, and now she was forced to learn what it meant to stand on her own. The legal proceedings stretched on for weeks, finalizing the transfer of deeds and accounts, securing my ownership of the garage in Syracuse, ensuring Harold and Linda could not appeal. Rachel handled most of it, guiding me through with patience and sharp skill. When the final papers arrived, embossed and official, I traced my finger over the seal and whispered, "Thank you, Grandpa." His legacy was safe, not just in my hands, but in the truth that had been defended. But beyond the property and money, the real resolution came in quieter ways. I moved out of the Albany house, unable to breathe under its memories. With Rachel's help, I rented a small apartment in Burlington, Vermont, a modest place with sunlit windows and a view of Lake Champlain. I enrolled in a local IT program, determined to shape a career that was mine alone. The days filled with coding assignments, coffee runs, and quiet evenings setting up the furniture I had salvaged, the sofa. The TV, the little things that had once been contested but were now symbols of my resilience. Harold faced trial months later. The videos Mark had captured, the affidavit, the police records, and the testimonies from neighbors painted a picture too damning to ignore. He was convicted on charges of domestic assault and coercion. He received a sentence that took him out of my life for years. Linda attended the hearings, her eyes hollow, her loyalty still tangled in the man who had destroyed our family. She barely glanced at me. By then, I no longer needed her gaze. The community shifted too. Where once neighbors had looked at me with pity, now they greeted me with nods of respect. Some apologized for not stepping in sooner, their words halting but sincere. Others offered quiet support casseroles on my doorstep notes slipped under my door. It was not perfect, but it was healing. And in Syracuse, the garage my grandfather had built became more than a building. With part of the inheritance, I restored it, hiring a team to bring it back to life. I hung a new sign above the door, Hayes Legacy Auto. The name gleamed in the winter light, a tribute to the man who had believed in me when no one else did. Standing there, the smell of oil and metal thick in the air, I felt him beside me, his voice echoing in my heart. Someday, this will be yours. And now it truly was. Yet the deepest resolution came inside me. For so long, I had defined myself by what I endured, Harold's fists, Linda's silence, Mia's scorn. Now I defined myself by what I had resisted, by the line I had drawn, by the voice I had reclaimed. My worth was no longer tied to their approval or their cruelty. It was mine to own, mine to protect. On a cold evening in Burlington, I sat by the window of my small apartment watching the snow fall, my laptop open with code glowing on the screen, my phone silent without their calls. I lifted my grandfather's chipped coffee mug, the same one I had carried from the old house, and whispered, "I chose myself." It was not a triumphant roar, but a steady truth, the kind that does not fade. Resolution was not about erasing the past. It was about carrying it forward as proof that I had survived, that I had fought, and that I had won. The winter in Syracuse lingered long after the courtroom victory, but I no longer feared the cold. It reminded me of that night in Albany when the snow was stained with blood, when my stepfather dragged me outside and left me trembling. I used to believe that image would haunt me forever, but now, when the flakes fell, I saw them differently. They were no longer symbols of pain. They were reminders of how far I had come. Months passed, and I poured myself into the garage my grandfather left behind. Hayes Legacy Auto was more than a business. It was a statement carved in brick and steel. Every time I unlocked its heavy door, I could almost hear his voice, the same one that had carried me through the darkest nights, telling me this legacy would be mine. The shop floor smelled of oil and fresh paint, the walls lined with tools polished and arranged with care. Mechanics came to work each morning with energy, and customers arrived not just for repairs, but to see what the old Hayes place had become. The community that had once watched me suffer now greeted me with nods of respect, their words of support warming what had once been cold. Yet even as life steadied, the past never fully loosened its grip. There were nights in my small Burlington apartment when I woke in a sweat, convinced I could still hear Harold's boots on the floorboards or Linda's voice dripping with contempt. But then I would see the affidavit framed on my desk, the notary's stamp clear and official, and I would remember that silence had been broken. My words had mattered. My truth had stood unshaken. That reminder steadied me. Sometimes I thought of my mother. I wondered if she sat alone in that Albany kitchen, staring at the empty chair where Harold once barked orders, wondering how she had lost her daughter. The calls had stopped after the trial. I had blocked her number, knowing that any conversation would only reopen wounds. Perhaps one day she would realize what she had thrown away, but forgiveness was no longer my duty. Protecting my peace was. Mia's name appeared occasionally in conversations with mutual acquaintances. I heard she was working long hours in Boston, her polished future less certain than she had expected. She had wanted the easy inheritance, the ready-made life, but now she was forced to build her own. I did not take pleasure in her struggles, but neither did I offer pity. She had chosen to stand against me, and she had reaped the consequence. What surprised me most was the quiet strength that followed. For years, I believed survival meant silence, but survival had led me to speak louder than I ever thought possible. It had led me to Rachel, whose loyalty and sharp mind guided me through storms. It had led me to Mark, who risked his safety to expose the truth. It had led me to neighbors who, though late, finally stood as witnesses. And it had led me back to myself, the girl my grandfather believed in, the woman who now carried his name forward. One evening, as the sun set behind the garage, casting long shadows across the snow, I stood outside with Rachel. She looked at the new sign, Hayes Legacy Auto, gleaming in gold against the brick. "You know, she said your grandfather would be proud." I swallowed hard, blinking against the sting in my eyes. "He gave me more than this garage," I said softly. "He gave me the belief that I was worth fighting for." She squeezed my shoulder, her silence carrying more comfort than words. I began to find joy in small things, the sound of wrenches clinking on the workbench, the laughter of coworkers during lunch breaks, the quiet hum of my laptop as I studied coding late into the night. Life was not perfect, but it was mine, shaped by choices I had made, scars I had earned, and victories I had claimed. Sometimes I revisited Albany, though never the old house. I would walk past Bill and Margaret's porch, wave to them as they shoveled snow or watered flowers in spring. They always smiled, their eyes softer now, their voices filled with a pride that erased the helplessness of the past. "You showed us what it means to stand up," Margaret once said. Her words lingered with me, a reminder that sometimes courage does more than protect one person. It ripples outward, touching others who may one day need their own reminder to rise. The final closure came quietly without fanfare. I stood alone in front of my grandfather's grave one cold March morning, the sky gray, the ground still hard with frost. I brushed snow from the stone, tracing his name carved deep into granite. George Hayes, beloved father, grandfather, and builder of dreams. My voice cracked as I whispered, "I kept your promise, Grandpa. They tried to erase it, but I carried it through. It is safe now. It is mine. And more than that, I am free." The wind rustled through the bare trees, a sound like a sigh, and for the first time I felt the past settle into place. Not as a weight, but as a foundation. Closure is not forgetting. It is knowing the story will not break you again. It is walking into winter without fear, drinking from the old coffee mug without tears, hanging a new sign without shame. Closure is hearing your own voice and believing it matters. I turned from the grave, the snow crunching under my boots, the horizon ahead wide and clear. My life was no longer theirs to dictate. It was mine to build brick by brick, just as my grandfather had built his garage. And as I walked forward, I carried one truth steady in my heart. Family should protect, not destroy. They chose control, violence, and lies. I chose myself. And in the end, that choice was the greatest inheritance of all.